Welcome to the Lessons from Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Brian Beckcom. My next guest is my first repeat guest, Nick Kalt. If you will remember, Nick Kalt is a Purple Heart Award recipient. He was injured in combat. He's a U.S. Naval Academy graduate where he was a rugby player, all-American rugby player after he switched from football. And then he fought for our country as a Marine Corps officer in Iraq, where he was shot and badly wounded and ultimately discharged. And then he became a firefighter for the city of Long Beach, and he's been a firefighter since then. I wanted to get Nick on the podcast because in the first show, we talked so much about his military experience, about his leadership ideas, that we didn't even get a chance to talk about his career as a firefighter. And right now, obviously, there's massive fires going on in California, all over the American West. In fact, Nick told me during the podcast that there are 5 of the biggest fires in history, or in recorded history, going on right now in California and the American West. And so Nick and I talk about what it's like to be a firefighter, how he became a firefighter, what things that young people who are interested in being a firefighter should do to get prepared for that job, what it's like out in California right now with all these, what they call wildland fires, as opposed to stuff going on in the city. Nick also, as a firefighter for the city of Long Beach, does a lot of work in a first responder capacity. So for instance, he's responding to auto accidents and cars on fire and people hurt using the jaws of life and things like that, in addition to fighting structural fires. Nick also talks a little bit about the causes of some of these wildland fires and how we're going about attacking them and getting them under control, and also what the future may hold. So this is a really tight, focused podcast on firefighting, the American West, some of the causes of these wildland fires, and what the future holds. Nick was one of the most popular guests I've had so far, and this episode is just as good, if not better, than the last episode. And now I give you U.S. Marine Corps officer and current Long Beach firefighter, Nick Kalt. The first repeat guest, and your first episode, Nick, was one of the most popular episodes of the podcast, but when we were talking, we had such a good time during our conversation that we ended up talking mainly about your military experience and your advice on leadership and things like that. We didn't even get a chance to talk about something I think is super cool, super important, especially right now, is after you got out of the military, you became a firefighter in California, and you're literally right in the thick of all these fires that are happening in the West and California right now. So I really appreciate you coming on. I want to get kind of straight to the point, Nick, because everybody probably has already listened to your first episode, so they know a little bit about you. If you haven't listened to the first episode with Nick Kalt and you're listening right now, go back, listen to that episode. You'll learn everything you need to know about Nick. He's an American hero. He's a Marine, and now he's a firefighter. So Nick, again, I know you're super busy out there. How are things going out there with your firefighting stuff?
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, for having me on for a second time. I feel honored to be the first second timer, so thank you for that. But yeah, things are going really well. I think all things considered. We're in a state right now, not just in California, but I think the entire American West, where wildland firefighting specifically has changed pretty dramatically, I would say, over the last decade, but really acutely, I would say, in the last probably 3 or 4 years. And I want to preface anything that I'm going to talk to you about as far as wildland firefighting is concerned by saying that is not, I'm not the subject matter expert as far as wildland firefighting is concerned. I work for the City of Long Beach Fire Department, and we do primarily structural firefighting.
Yeah.
And so, but, you know, as wildland firefighting techniques and tactics have progressed, you know, we've become more and more involved over the years in doing a lot of the wildland stuff as well. So we do have a fair share of, of guys involved doing that right now.
Is it kind of, Nick, is it kind of all hands on deck right now in terms of them just needing firefighters with all these fires going on? Or how is it? Because I think what you're saying is, you know, when we think of, you know, not to be funny, but the Dalmatian and the fire pole and going out and rescuing cats and putting out building fires, that's kind of, that's kind of the traditional way we think of firemen and firewomen. But what you're talking about is now we've got all these fires that are not near structures necessarily, at least when they start, but they're out in the wilderness and they're just massive.
Right.
So,
Right.
so is it kind of like all hands on deck out there right now, or are there groups of firefighters that specialize in one type of firefighting over the other?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Let me kind of take them in segments. So um, there are separate groups that specialize in different kind of firefighting. Again, the organization that I belong to, which is the Long Beach Fire Department, we serve the citizens of the city of Long Beach here in California, which is a very densely packed urban area, more densely populated than the city of Los Angeles, actually. So
Really? Did not know that. Wow.
yeah, and so really the large majority of the things that we do on a daily basis consist of EMS, or emergency medical services, which is providing those basic medical services to folks up until the point where we can get them to a hospital.
Yeah.
So we provide paramedic services, ambulance services, and just basic first responder services. That's probably, I would say, about 75 to 80% of what we do. The other, 20, 25% being, not only stuff like injury, traffic accidents, but also your occasional fire. And I wish I could tell you that we were fighting structural firefighters on a daily basis. The fact of the matter is, it's just not the case. It's kind of a pendulum swing where we'll go, a few shifts with going to multiple fires, and then we might go for a week, a month and a half without what we would call a good working structural firefight. As far as wildland is concerned, we do have some mixed use and wildland type I guess occupancies within our city, but it's a pretty densely packed urban area. There are different entities that do primarily the wildland firefighting, and when we're talking about that in the state of California, we're talking about Cal Fire, we're talking about the Forest Service, and then a lot of these city fire departments like ours, even though we don't have them yet, we'll have OES, or Office of Emergency Services. And so the federal fire department, or the feds, will have specific wildland firefighting gear that we will staff, but it's sent to our locations to be manned and staffed and maintained by us. So there are different entities throughout the state of California that might, you would say, like, own a firefight, depending on where a fire breaks out. Cal Fire may be the owning agency, the U.S. Forest Service might be the owning agency, and then what they will do is they'll send out requests, and then based on regions, we'll send out resources that we have available to help with those individual firefights where they crop up.
Gotcha. So kind of kind of on an as-needed basis. Hey, we need some help with this particular thing or that particular thing. And they may call some of your people out to help them out.
Exactly.
Kind of how it goes. Okay.
Exactly.
All right. Well, let's talk. I want to talk a little bit about that in more detail, Nick. But before we do, briefly, you got out of the military after being wounded in combat, and then became a firefighter in the city of Long Beach. How did you become a firefighter? So, in other words, like, if there are people, young people, and I know people right now, Nick, young people like in their 20s that are literally going out to California, quitting their job. I know a guy that's a math major that's out there right now fighting in some of these fires. So for people that are interested in becoming firemen or firewomen, what was your path to becoming a fireman or a firewoman? And also, what kind of things would you recommend people do or think about or read or work on if they're interested in becoming a fireman or a firewoman?
Sure. So good questions. First of all, I'll talk about my path. Again, I was in the military up until the summer of 2006. I got hired in 2008 with the city of Long Beach. In the interim, I knew that I wanted to get out of the Marine Corps and transition to a career. At the time, I thought I wanted a career in teaching.
Interesting.
And so, I went back. I got my my teaching credential. I started doing some substitute teaching. In the meantime, looking for a full-time teaching position. And while I was doing this, realized that I didn't enjoy it to the level that I thought I might.
Yeah.
I had a guy who lived across the street from me who's a fellow firefighter with me in the city of Long Beach now, but at the time he was an engineer with the fire department. And I think he knew I was maybe a bit disillusioned with the teaching path and kind of the mismatch between what I had hoped it would be and what it actually turned out to be for me. And he just basically invited me on what we call a ride along and had me up to his fire station for 24 hours. And is in the city of Long Beach. It's a real busy area where our station number 3 is. Really densely populated area, really large homeless population, really large fire load, different occupancy types. And we were super busy the entire day and night. And I was just grinning ear to ear the entire time because it provided a lot of the different elements of what I really missed a lot from the Marine Corps. And to include the camaraderie, the physicality, the ability to work with your hands, the ability to conduct some time critical decision making, and all these things appealed to my nature as a Marine Corps officer, and I could see myself doing that job as a firefighter. And so that was kind of my transition. After spending that 24 hours, I knew that that's what I wanted to do, and so I kind of pursued that career path for the next 2 years until I got hired.
And what does that mean? Nick, what is that? What when you say pursue that career path? Like when somebody says, "Look, I want to be a fireman." What is that? What does that entail? What are the next steps they have to take?
Yeah. So let me talk. So for any of your listeners who listened to the previous podcast that I was on, I talked about admission to the United States Naval Academy and kind of starting your career as a Marine Corps naval officer via that route. And my number one recommendation for that career path, as it is for this career path, is immersion. And it was essentially to get to know as much about this career as possible before you actually commit to it. Number one, that's gonna provide you the level of exposure to really make an informed decision as far as, hey, is this really what I want to do with the rest of my life? Because it's a huge commitment to try and get hired. And then number two, by immersing yourself and by really learning as much as you can, you show up with something to offer. You show up as a new firefighter, a new Marine Corps officer, with a certain level of knowledge and ability just based on the amount of research that you've done to try and make yourself, really the most marketable that you can for this job specifically. My hiring process took about 2 years. So we literally, the guys on the fire engine that day drove me down to City Hall in Long Beach. And at the time they were accepting paper applications. Everything's online nowadays, of course, but I literally filled out a paper application in the back of the fire apparatus, and I walked up there and handed it in person. And that started the process, started the ball rolling. And in the meantime, I applied to a number of other places as well. But the process itself is a lengthy one, and it's very competitive. So it behooves you to kind of start things on a good foot. For those who are interested in doing it, there are a couple of steps that I think are common across the country, regardless of what type of organization you're looking to join. But there's always, just your basic application, like with any job, whether it's written or online. There's a physical component where they'll evaluate your physical ability, utilizing a lot of times a standardized physical test that usually kind of tests sort of your, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it, your ability to be gassed in a firefighting type scenario. There's usually a background check, which involves, not only a background conducted by a local police agency, but also psychological evaluation and a medical evaluation. And then there's an interview process. And typically it's a 2-tiered interview that starts off kind of at a lower level, we call it a captain's level interview, and then a chief's level interview, where you may be interviewing with the fire chief of the organization that you're trying out for as well. So a lot of different hurdles to get through, but it's definitely a worthwhile jump to make for people who are vested in doing it.
And how important is, because you're a real physical person. I mean, you were an All-American rugby player in college. You're also an outstanding football player until you transitioned to rugby. You've always been a really, really good athlete. How important is it? And I would think maybe it would depend on what specific job you were doing within the fire department. But how important is the physical component of being a firefighter?
I'd say it's fairly important. It's a job that exposes you to a lot of danger. And when I say danger, I don't necessarily mean running inside of a burning building, but you got everything from vehicle traffic on the freeway, which in my opinion is one of the most dangerous things that we do.
Absolutely.
But also, as we talked about in our last podcast as well, a lot of exposure to communicable disease.
Yeah.
And then I think you compound that with a lot of sleepless nights. I work a 24-hour schedule, but sometimes we're on for 72, 96 hours at a shot.
Wow.
Or if you're going to one of these wildland fires, you get your off-duty time, but you're working a wildland fire for 2 weeks straight, and you end up with a lot of sleepless nights and a lot of broken sleep, which, as you know, is a huge factor as far as increasing your risk for cancer, increasing your risk for really a whole lot of physical maladies, high blood pressure, psychological detriment that really you're not faced with in a lot of other kinds of careers. And so I think it behooves you to be as prepared physically as you can be in order to kind of suffer some of the rigors that the career puts you through. And again, the rigors aren't necessarily kind of like the drop and give me 20 that the military might expose you to, but they're just like the rigors that the toll that your body takes over the long run. I think it really benefits you if you have a background that allows you to be resilient physically.
And so how big is the Long Beach Fire Department? Like how many people are there? How big is it in comparison to maybe, a standard fire department in a standard similar sized city?
Sure. So the city of Long Beach itself, and don't quote me on this, but I think it has roughly about 500,000 people. We have 23 fire stations. I think sworn personnel were somewhere in the neighborhood of 350 firefighters.
Wow.
So,
and is that full time? Is that every one of those full time?
Full time paid firefighters. And so the nice part about the city of Long Beach is that we consider ourselves all hazard. We have a lot of different things that we go up against that test you as a firefighter. It's a big city, all different kinds of structures, all different kinds of people, extremely diverse. But it's small enough where you literally know everybody. Yeah. And so I know all 350 or however many of it is of my brothers and sisters, which is kind of cool because you don't get that in a lot of our neighboring agencies like the Orange counties or the LA City, LA County. Yeah. We're small enough that kind of what everybody else is made of and have a real rapport and sort of a real family atmosphere with everyone.
And so how would you divide the type of work on a routine basis, setting aside the wildlife fires we've got going on right now, but on a regular, kind of weekly, monthly basis, what percentage of your time is spent actually fighting fires versus going to traffic accidents or doing other things like that?
Sure. Again, probably 80% of what we do is EMS related. And that's everything from stubbed toes to heart attacks, and a lot of stuff in between. The portion of Long Beach where I work is a fairly low income population. And for better or for worse, I think a lot of folks tend to use our services as almost like their primary care. They either may not have a primary care physician, they may not have medical insurance, but they have access to 911. And so sometimes we'll show up on scene and is it a genuine emergency that dictates that you call 911? Not necessarily. But then a lot of times it is. And so I'd say probably about 80% of what we do is medical related. And whether or not you end up going to the emergency room at the end of that interaction is kind of hit and miss, but 80% of what we do is probably EMS related. I'd say the other 20% can be anything. Like you said, we do a lot of traffic accidents where my station is in particular. We're at the intersection of two fairly highly trafficked freeways here in Southern California. So we do a lot of vehicle accident mitigation, whether that's, extricating a patient from a smashed up vehicle, or just, controlling the scene and providing EMS care for people that require it on scene.
And maybe the other part of that is kind of a combo. Nick, tell me about this, but there are probably instances where you've got some sort of big traffic accident where you've got fires in or around the vehicles. Plus, you've got to take care of people that are injured, extricate them from the vehicle. So that I would imagine that would be kind of a pretty complicated kind of call that you would have to deal with.
It can be, and it's definitely a little bit of a faster pace, more high intensity when a vehicle fire is involved in that situation. Yeah, vehicle's a very small space that's not super livable once all those different components, which a lot of them are a lot of them are plastics and
Yeah.
polystyrenes now, and just, I mean, go up at the blink of an eye and in flames, and also provide just a really toxic environment for whoever's trying to survive in there. So
Yeah.
it definitely adds an element of complication to that when we arrive on scene and find that.
And so when you get to a scene like, the jaws of life, most people have heard of the jaws of life. Or is your department the department that if extrication with something mechanical means like the jaws of life is necessary, that's the department, like your department would be in charge of that?
Yeah, our station in particular, we have all the vehicle extrication equipment on our trucks. So our truck companies and our urban search and rescue, we have 4 truck companies in our city and 1 urban search and rescue vehicle, and those units specifically are tasked with vehicle extrication. And so we carry the jaws and the cutters and the hydraulic rams and everything, all the different tools and equipment that we utilize in order to provide extrication. The nice part is that I think modern vehicles have become a lot more survivable, even though they've become lighter in a lot of ways. Just the airbag systems on them, and even just how they're designed. They don't necessarily stand up to a crash as well, but they provide that passenger space a lot more protection than they typically would in the past.
No doubt about that. And as a lawyer, I've actually specialized in the past in product liability cases against automotive companies. I mean, it's funny to me, Nick, because back in the early 70s, when the government was talking about mandating seat belts, the auto companies were totally and completely against it. Same thing with airbags, and same thing with a lot of these other safety measures. But you're exactly right. In my experience, cars across the board, cars and trucks, are far safer because of these safety measures. But Nick, let me ask you, so how does the decision tree work? Let's say you get called, or your team gets called to some sort of highway accident of some sort. You get out there and the vehicles are on fire and there are people trapped inside. Like, how does that process? I would assume that the number one objective would be to get the people out alive first, but then you've also got to deal with like you were saying, the fact that there's a lot of flammable stuff in these cars, and explosive materials and things like that. So how would you triage a situation where you've got folks in a car that cannot get out, and there's fires and stuff around the vehicles or in the vehicles?
Sure. Good question. So let me give you my big picture before I give you kind of the smaller picture of the specific scenario. The big picture, and I think this is why a lot of previous members of the military make such good first responders, firefighters, police, EMS, is that the decision tree in a lot of these things tends to be the same. In the fire service, we refer to it as ICS, Incident Management System. And basically, the idea is that the system expands or contracts based on the resources that you need and the groups and divisions that you need to assign to any particular problem. It's kind of a problem-solving method for whatever problem that you throw at it. And it works in the military just as it does in the fire service. And we're taught to evaluate a situation kind of at a snap judgment. And rather than wait for the 100% correct solution, you apply what we in the Marine Corps called the 80% solution, which is, hey, enact this solution that you see as the best time-critical decision-making solution to insert yourself into this problem and try and mitigate the situation. And then by mitigating that, you can reevaluate kind of
buying yourself time, basically. You're buying yourself time in a way, right?
Yeah, in a way. And sort of what we say in the fire service is that when you eliminate the fire, a lot of your other problems go away. And so if you can insert yourself in between that fire or that accident or whatever it is that's going on that's impinging upon that person's ability to survive, if you can kind of put yourself in the way of that in the most effective way possible, you start mitigating that problem, then you make the entire rest of the scenario more survivable for the person on scene.
And it sounds like too, Nick, you're talking about this 80% rule. It sounds like from the Marines too, it's kind of a bias towards doing something, like taking some sort of action, and not waiting around, in other words, until you're 100% sure that this or that is what you need to do, but do something to essentially buy yourself some time, make sure that people are safe, things like that. So is it kind of a bias towards action? Is that kind of what
it is?
Okay.
100% bias
Yeah.
towards action.
Yeah.
And we have a couple little acronyms, just like in the Marine Corps, but we have a couple in the fire service as well that sort of dictate what those actions should be. And life safety or rescue is always our number one priority. And so when I first evaluate a scene, when I show up on scene, my number one determining factor is, where do we need to put ourselves in order to effect a rescue? Where do we need to put ourselves in order to make this scenario survivable for the people that are being impacted by it?
Yeah.
And that's really kind of the deciding factor that sets all the other wheels in motion as far as the scene management is concerned. And so whether you're talking a vehicle fire, a house fire, a vehicle accident, even just an EMS call, it's that life safety portion of that problem solving is our number one problem to be solved.
Can I ask you kind of I don't know if this is going to sound like something of a strange question or a weird question, but I've seen plenty of photographs of burned up vehicles with burned up people inside. I've seen some pretty bad stuff, and I'm sure you've seen it in person, and so the people that you work with. Is there any sort of training or preparation for seeing the kind of really tough things that you as firefighters may have to see from time to time? Because this is the kind of thing like that can cause people some PTSD and things like that. I mean, I would imagine as a Marine Corps officer, you might be a little bit more resilient when it comes to things like that. But for example, for the people that are firefighters that have never been Marine officers or seen this sort of thing, like, what do you do to help your firefighters when they come upon these grotesque scenes and there's dead bodies and really bad stuff? Like, how do you handle that? How do you take care of your folks?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. We talked a little bit about post-traumatic stress and the concepts of resilience and then post-traumatic growth in the previous podcast. And I'm a huge believer in preparing yourself prior to showing up on scene of something like this. And truthfully, Brian, you show up to some of these scenes and they're either so I don't want to say physically gruesome, but they tug at your heartstrings so much, and everybody reacts differently to different situations. I, for instance, am really susceptible to having a very strong emotional reaction to incidents where children are hurt or injured or sick. I think probably because I have children, and I'm sure you're probably in the same boat, but everybody reacts differently to all these different scenes. And I think, unfortunately, there's no real way of knowing how you'll react until you're tested with some of those different scenarios. And then the other thing is, truthfully, once you thought you'd seen it all, something else comes and replaces it. And whether it's, I've never seen anything this ridiculous before, or this, this hair raising before, or this bloody before, and then something else will come and replace it. I'm a huge proponent of preparing yourself mentally prior to going into a scenario like that. A lot of that might involve emergency scene simulations, where you're kind of putting yourself in the driver's seat and imagining what a response like that will be like. I have a real good friend who's he's a lieutenant for the city of Boston Fire Department, and they were one of the first units on scene after the Boston marathon bombing.
Oh man!
And they arrived on scene, and it was absolutely chaotic. And he had really started to explore the concept of hardening yourself physically and mentally to a scenario like that prior to showing up on scene. And he had actually he co-authored a book that assisted in preparing yourself mentally. It's called Fire Psyche. And,
really nice. Fire Psyche. Yeah.
It's kind of just, it's touching on, it's sort of in its infancy in the fire service. Whereas I think for the military and professional sport, the concept of mental preparation in advance of this really grueling physical and psychological activity that you're about to take place in has been recognized as hugely beneficial for athletes, law enforcement, military for years now, maybe even decades. And they're sort of perfecting it. Whereas for the fire service, we're sort of just now jumping on board with it. But I talked to him a little bit about it, and he had literally handed a copy of this book to all of his firefighters. I think it may have been on the day that they responded to this emergency, and he was kind of like, oh man, why have I not addressed this sooner with these guys? And it's everything from, breathing techniques to negative thought stopping, and some of these things that pro athletes have used for years now that allow them to be at the very top of their game, and physical conditioning being one of those elements like we talked about earlier.
For sure. Tom Watson, who's a famous golfer, I think he won 8 or 9 majors. He has a famous saying. He goes, I didn't win a major until I learned how to breathe properly on the golf course.
Sure.
But, Nick, I'm sitting here thinking about, there was a incredibly tragic crash probably almost 2 decades ago in Houston, where a family of 3 kids, a mom went to pick up dad from the airport. He had been away at work, and they're driving home, and essentially an 18-wheeler tipped over on the truck that they were all in, and mom survived and everybody else burned alive over a period of time. And so, and firefighters have to see that sort of thing regularly. And so I'm a little surprised that it's not a little bit more advanced in terms of preparing firefighters for that thing, because I would think that firefighters see that just as much, if not more, as any other first responders, EMS, police, right? I mean, you're seeing it just as much, right?
Yeah. But let me say this. So firefighting is a 200-year-old career, unimpeded by progress. So, a lot of the changes that you talk about making, and I would say even more so than the military, it is very entrenched and very steeped in tradition and history. And I spoke to another friend of mine who's a lieutenant for the FDNY in New York, and we were talking about some of the effects that COVID had when everything was kind of ground zero there in Manhattan. And he said he saw more change in a 12-hour shift on a daily basis than he had seen in a decade there.
Wow.
Because just by the nature of the threat that was posed to them, you had to be that flexible, and their entire organization, which hadn't seen systemic change, was changing daily, which is really kind of astounding when you consider the fire service. And I don't mean to say that the fire service hasn't made strides in the psychological and physical preparation. Within our organization, we have what's called the CISD, or Critical Incident Stress Debriefing Team, of members who are trained to deal with those really high stress responses, and they will respond to the location of the response or to the fire station after you've gone on that response, and help get you the psychological assistance that you need, whether it's debriefing with them or with a professional. We also do a lot of preparation physically. We have a wellness program that aims to educate us in practices such as good sleep, healthy diet, physical and mental preparation for the rigors of the job, like we talked about, and then just the concept of resilience and post-traumatic growth that you and I have spoken about, that I really kind of preach to my firefighters, but that I feel like everybody should take on as sort of a physical, a personal responsibility, just as making yourself as capable as you can be in order to face the rigors of the job.
For sure. Well, Nick, let's talk about the wildfires. So you characterize, how did you do the Western wildfires, or how did you call wildlife fires? How do you differentiate?
So we refer to them in our fire department as wildland fires. A lot of the catchphrase right now is WUI, WUI, like wildland urban interface. And across the American West, and I don't mean to say that these don't take place in the East as well, but I such a of catastrophic fires in the world now for a number of reasons, but due largely just to our climate and the fact that really the Western United States, for lack of a better description, is a bit of a desert, and it can be high desert, kind of up towards the Rockies, or low desert here, and it doesn't seem like it because we're so close to the ocean, but we're truly a desert climate, and the combination of a lot of different factors have created fire conditions in the American West over the past, I would say specifically 4 to 5 years, that have been sort of unprecedented, and I think like none that we've ever seen before.
I had an experience in Colorado this summer, Nick. So I like to hike when I'm in Colorado, and I'm normally in like the Beaver Creek, Vail Valley area, and I kind of hike up to the top of the different mountains up there. And I got to tell you, Nick, it was as dry as I have seen it in 15 years. I mean, I felt like a spark would set the entire mountain off. And matter of fact, there were a number of fires in Colorado when I was up there, including a big fire in Grand Junction that was caused by an 18-wheeler driver just throwing a cigarette butt out the window when he's driving down the road. There was another fire that was probably less than 10 miles from the Beaver Creek area, which has a ton of very expensive houses. It's an big economic deal for the entire state of Colorado. And so I got to see firsthand 5 or 6 helicopters and planes flying over this. It was a small fire, but you could tell they were just that they knew that if this fire jumped across the highway, jumped across I-70, it was going to be a economic disaster. And so they were all over this. But the thing that really struck me, Nick, the most, like you're talking about, was I just could not believe how dry it was. I mean, there's dry, and then there's like bone dry, and it was bone dry in Colorado this summer. So is that kind of like it is out west where you are?
It is, and we talk about fuel moisture levels, and they just continue to dry. And obviously, when it rains or snows, that fuel moisture level increases. But then when it just gets dried out like that, I mean, we haven't had measurable rainfall, I would say, probably since April, maybe, and that's not uncharacteristic for where I live and for a lot of the regions out here. And so you combine that with, and I know I might raise a few hackles, but with, global warming, forest management over the past generations, and combine it with, just a climate cycle that seems to be trending towards more warm. Yeah. And it's producing fire conditions that, whether they're started accidentally or intentionally, are just moving far faster and far more intensely than we've seen them in years. And again, I'm not a wildland expert by any means, but in talking to the folks that are, it sounds like this fire behavior is really unprecedented.
Yeah, and it's funny you'd bring that up, Nick, because I'm sitting there looking at my notes right next to me, and I was going to ask you the causes of these fires. And one thing I've been really thinking about a lot over the last 4 or 5 months is, we've gotten to the point in this country where you either have to be for the police or for the BLM. You got to be for this side or for that side. Like we've lost the ability to say some of this is probably forest and land management. Some of this is probably some climate change issues, and some of it is human behavior. So, for instance, the fire in Grand Junction in Colorado this summer, which I think burned 30,000 acres or something like that. That was a combination of all three. Clearly, without the trucker throwing the cigarette out, there's no fire. That's the human component. The global warming component is there hadn't been any rain up there in a long time, and that's not normal. And then you've got the management of the wilderness area. Sometimes maybe we don't manage as well as we could. The other thing, Nick, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit, is fires in and of themselves in the wilderness area can be good. I mean, they're natural. It's natural to have fires out there. So it's not like these fires are all bad. I mean, you got to have some fires to clear out the junk and stuff. It's the problem with these uncontrolled fires, I think, that's the difference now, right?
Sure. And again, they're moving at a pace that I think is unprecedented and an intensity. And I think, we're as population increases across the West too, people want homes kind of out in the woods. I want one too, I wish I could afford one.
Yeah.
But you start running up against the problem of, okay, now we're in a place where fire is much more likely to burn.
Yeah.
I talked about the city of Long Beach, where we don't have a whole lot of wildland urban interface. And so as a result, we don't get wildland fires because there's not a whole lot of wildland area. But when you're in an area that, if it hasn't burned in a few years, part of the natural cycle of forest replenishment is that occasionally they burn. Yeah. And it's a challenge and a task and a risk that I think maybe some folks don't recognize when they move to those areas that might be a little bit more susceptible to that. And then obviously the economic impact is massive, because you talk about the rescue of those people or the protection of their homes, and now you're talking about millions and sometimes billions of dollars worth of resources in order to do that when you scale it up.
Yeah, for sure. So how is it different? First of all, let me ask you this question. I was reading earlier this morning, and there's something now in California called a Gigafire, which sounds like terrible. So what's a Gigafire?
Man, that's a great question, Brian. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I saw on the news. I guess it just means there's some massive, like they've combined, different fires have combined or something. But I'd never heard that phrase before.
A lot of the time we'll call that a complex, and maybe when two fires join up. So what's crazy about these fires is when they burn for long enough and intensely enough, they generate their own weather system, which then starts to perpetuate these cycles of fires that are coming through. But to put in perspective kind of what's going on, 5 of the largest, I believe, 15 historical fires on record in the state of California were still burning as of last week when I checked the CAL FIRE website.
Really?
5 of the greatest, most destructive fires of all time are actively burning in our lifetime in one fire season.
And what do you even do about those fires? I imagine fighting those fires would be drastically different than fighting fires inside the city of Long Beach. So like, how do the strategies differ? How are they the same?
They differ pretty dramatically, and they're on such a massive scope because there are hundreds and thousands of acres that these fires are burning. And so the scope of the incident command system that we talked about, that ICS system, the scope of seeing the big picture on that is just absolutely massive, and you have so many resources responding. And so it becomes a huge task just to get people evacuated, let alone trying to cordon this thing off to prevent it from doing any more damage.
Yeah.
And the coordination is on just an epic scale that I think I don't even fully understand just logistically. But I think a lot of it, you have a lot of different ground level tactics that you can employ with the ultimate job of preserving people's life safety and their property while stabilizing the incident.
I mean, how do you even, so I get that. And that seems like very similar to the priority when you're working for the Long Beach Fire Department, that human life first, let's get everybody out, let's evacuate the people that are in danger. But how the heck do you, what do you even do? Where do you even start with a fire as massive as some of these fires? Like I would just throw my hands up and go, man, I don't even know where to begin to get these things under control.
You know, and again, this is not my area of true expertise, but I think the number one thing is just predictions, predicting these fires based on fire behavior, weather, and fuel, and getting the word out and actually having people comply with these evacuation orders, these evacuation warnings. That's a huge, huge deal, right? Because life safety, as with these smaller, structure fires that I'm fighting, is our number one priority.
Yeah.
And so if you can get people out of the way of these freight trains that are moving towards them, that's the number one thing. And you do that based on predictive models. And granted, the modeling has changed over the past few years, but if you can predict this fire behavior based on predicted weather and predicted winds, then I think you're about as far ahead of the game as you can get. I think the next thing for a lot of these, like the CAL FIRES and the Forest Service, is to request the appropriate resources and just get boots on the ground, get that 80% solution in place. And then a lot of these fires, they're too big to fight head on. Yeah. And so you have to fight them, from places where they've already burned, protect structures that you can, and unfortunately write off areas where you have to write them off. And if you can do that, providing for life safety, I think we consider that a win nowadays.
They're like in the place in Colorado where I stay, they have literally whole sections of the mountain where all the trees have been clear cut because they're creating fire breaks. And so is that part of it too, where you just basically try to get rid of all the fuel that these fires are going to use, or is it just too big really to do that?
Well, when you talk about getting rid of fuel, I mean, the real getting rid of fuel is the fires themselves. They burn the fuel and the undergrowth and stuff that's collected, over years. So in order to burn off the fuel, like we talked about, the natural replenishment of the forest and just a healthy life cycle of a forest occasionally involves fire. And that's going to reduce fuel load for generations to come. I think, the Forest Service will admit that their fire mitigation strategy over past generations has been to stamp fires out, before they get any headway, which resulted in just a massive amount of fuel that's going to burn later when you really can't stop it. And I think the Forest Service and other agencies have realized that fires are good to a certain extent for the health of a forest.
For sure.
Not only for, the life of a forest, but also for providing a slightly reduced fuel load for the future.
Yeah.
When you talk about actually like bringing trucks in and the logistical effort of removing undergrowth and burned out trees and trees that have felled from years previous, it's a massive, massive undertaking.
Yeah.
Especially when you consider a lot of the terrain that you're talking about operating in. I'm not really sure how realistic that would be. It's a thought, but yeah, economically and logistically, I'm not sure how realistic.
I can't even imagine how they would go. I mean, you would have to remove so much stuff that it would just be such a massive undertaking. So in Texas, what we do all the time, we have mesquite and cedar issues sometime, and that can be very invasive. And we'll use fires on land to clear that out. And that seems to be much more effective, much easier, frankly, than rooting out all those cedar trees, mesquite trees, and stuff like that. So maybe what I hear you saying is, maybe going forward, we need to start some fires ourselves to kind of clear stuff out. Of course, the problem is it's so dry, like you said, there hasn't been a big rain in April that, you start a fire that you think is controlled. Next thing you know, it's out of control. So you got to be real careful about that, right?
Well, and these guys are professionals, and I will say that the Forest Service, CAL FIRE do an excellent job of planned burns, right? And burning out areas that they call them prescribed burns, but essentially, in conjunction with the health of a wildland area or a forest area, they will have these prescribed burns so they can do it safely, taking into account wind direction, weather conditions, life safety issues for people that may live nearby, and ultimately providing for people's safety and the well-being of the forest. So they do some of that stuff for sure.
How close, Nick, are we to getting through these big fires out in the West and California and other places? I mean, are we 4 months away, 6 months away? Are we going to be dealing with this for years?
Yeah.
I mean, what's the future look like?
Yeah, everybody used to call it fire season. And for us in Southern California, just based on my loose understanding, fire season was bounded by the months when what we call the Santa Ana winds start to blow from the Four Corners area. But we tend to get hot, dry winds, I would say, anytime from August till about November. But I mean, really, we're getting fires cropping up, in May, June nowadays, and they're going right through Christmas. So what was traditionally, a 2, 3, maybe 4 month, what we call a fire season, has now expanded to kind of an indefinite time period. And really, these fires, I think, will continue to burn until there's a significant amount of rainfall in the places that are being affected by them.
Yeah.
At least in California, that seems to be the case.
Or they run out of fuel, right? Yeah. Or they just burn up all their fuel. Yeah.
Sure. And I will say that a lot of the fires, even though they're burning, and we talked about those 5 of the largest, 15 fires still burning actively, that doesn't mean that they're burning uncontained. So when you can get the containment around them, that tends to dictate their behavior in the direction that they're going to burn a lot more than when they're just burning uncontrolled and freely.
Well, Nick, I don't know, and I'm fairly sure that no one really knows how much of this is global warming, how much of this is the management, the human management, how much of this is us building in areas where we should be. But here's one thing I do know. I certainly hope that the appropriate experts use this opportunity to figure out, part of this is climate change, and here's what we can do about it. Part of this is management. Here's what we can do about it. Part of this is the human activity, and here's what we can do about it. It worries me a little bit that, like everything nowadays, even the California fires are kind of being politicized in a way, and I think that's a problem. I hope we can get past this. Well, Nick, I wanted to get you on, and we talked earlier on about doing a quicker episode, but of course, you're such an interesting guy. I knew it would take a little bit longer, but I don't want to keep you any longer. I really am glad you came on the show. I'm going to try to get this episode out as quick as I can because I know people are very, very interested in this topic
Okay.
right now. And Nick, keep doing what you're doing, man. It's great to see you again. Thank you for another hour of your time. I got to send you an Amazon gift card or something.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Yeah, but anyway, thank you for everything. You already served our country once. You're doing it again, and thank you for everything you've done. And also thank you, by the way, for telling us what it's like to be a firefighter. And you're kind of in California. Being a firefighter is kind of like being a Marine in Afghanistan right now. I mean, you're in the center of the action, and so it makes me feel good. Frankly, I know it'll make a lot of people feel good. The guy like Nick Kalt is taking the lead on this sort of thing. So Nick, good to see you again, man. I hope everything's going well. And if I can ever do anything for you, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, man.
No, I appreciate it, Brian. Thank you for having me. It's really been my pleasure. And if I could touch on just one thing before we go, like you said, these fires are really of kind of epic proportions. And, unfortunately, I think it's the way a lot of things are trending in our world as we're seeing now. And I think there's an argument that can be made for and against global warming, or for any number of reasons.
Sure.
But all these things that we're facing nowadays are so complicated. There's not just one factor. And I believe in global warming.
Yeah.
Whether your listeners do or not is completely up to them. But at the end of the day, I think being able to have a conversation and collaborate on the resolutions to a lot of these issues are what is going to be the thing that gets us through. It's the collaboration and the ability to have a human connection with another person. Having the opportunity to connect with you and with some of your listeners is such a great pleasure and a great honor. And I really appreciate it. It gives me cause for self-reflection and just helps me to view the world in a different way as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Nick, very much. We'll talk soon, man.
Okay. Take care, Brian.
Bye, brother.
Bye.
Hey, Brian Beckcom here. I hope you really liked the latest episodes of Lessons from Leaders. I really, really appreciate all the thousands and thousands of people that have commented, that have listened, that have subscribed, that have seen the shows. And if you're liking the show, it would really, really help me and all the guests if you would give it a rating, if you would subscribe, if you would comment and share on it. The algorithms that run the underlying platform, like I've talked about earlier, really like that. And so I'm not getting paid for this. The people that are on the show are not getting paid for this. We're doing this for one reason. We're doing this to spread some positive leadership, some positive stories, some fun stories out in the world. We've got far too much fighting going on right now. And so Lessons from Leaders is designed to focus on basically 100% positive leadership. And so if you're liking the show, if you want me to keep doing it, if you want me to keep getting good guests, boy, I would really, really appreciate it if you could like, comment, share, subscribe, do all those things so the podcast algorithms will continue to serve it up and more people will see it. And hopefully my guests and their views will have an even wider impact on the world than they already have. So anyway, thank you very much. And on to the next episode.